This table talk is made possible by Mental Health Matters, a newsletter from themighty.com. I'm Kat, and I'm joined by...
I'm Anthony.
And I'm Shruti.
And today we are talking about grief in all of its forms, the loss of people, of places, of experience, and even of ourselves. So thank you both for being here. We have a small group today, and I want to celebrate the fact that Anthony, first-time podcast for The Mighty, which is very exciting.
Hello, I am here. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me for my very first podcast.
And quite a topic you have come for as well. But you're here for a specific reason, is that you are a great reservoir for grief resources, and I know it's been a part of your life. So actually I wanted to kick it off. Shruti, you can start. I would love to hear either something that you're grieving right now, your experience with grief, anything you want to share.
I am grieving what could have been, a life that I could have had, a person that I could have been, if it wasn't for complex trauma or chronic pain.
Yeah, I think so. Grief has been a big part of my life. I recently got married about a month ago, and I think, grief is super complex. Both of my parents died when I was very young, so there's lots of different feelings around that, but especially when you're kind of getting married and having that absence, not necessarily just the feeling of, I miss this person or something like that, where I think that's kind of where a lot of people think about grief, but there's so much complexity around what grief is. And I think just kind of both having that sort of monumental experience without your parents, my in-laws not having in-laws, my wife not having in-laws, right? And just the experience of having memories of people that don't really exist in reality to people you're really close with. So I think grieving that experience for my wife a lot comes into play with my thinking.
Thank you both for sharing. And I think that brings up a great point, which is that grief is pretty unpredictable when it comes up, how it manifests. I actually recently lost a family member, and it's kind of wild the moments that it really hits me. I'll be boiling a pot of water, and I have no memory attached to this person with boiling a pot of water, but that's just when it happens to hit me. The other thing, and I haven't really spoken about this publicly, but it's part of my healing journey, but I was recently diagnosed with lupus, and the condition has completely just exploded my life for a lot of reasons. But similar to you, Shruti, and I think a lot of our Mighty community is, even though this diagnosis changes nothing in terms of I'm not worse now than I was a month ago, I can't help but I just feel such sadness for the person I was pre-diagnosis. And for some reason, this keeps happening every time I get another label thrown on. I'm curious if the health component comes up for you both in other ways.
And that's for me a lot, I guess. And I've been in pain for the longest time, right? Since school. So at that time when I was growing up, I didn't really realize it. But now that I do, and I look back on, again, what could have been, should have been, the person I could have been, the dreams that I could have followed, if it wasn't for pain, it hits me a lot. And it comes in waves over and over again. And sure, it goes away, but it hits just as hard the next time.
I feel that. Anthony, do you find that, has it been an up and down process for you? Some moments more intense than others?
Yeah, and I think to both of your points, a big part of grief is grieving what could have been or might have been, or just what was. I think a lot about how not having parents or have affected me. I think not having, parts of that kind of your life affects you. Same with your health too, where if somebody that dies of an illness, or let's say somebody dies from suicide, or somebody dies from drug abuse, there's a lot of, my experience with grief is those worries really affect you as well. So if somebody died of something that can be passed on, the trauma of that, but then also just the complexity of having that in your mind and worrying about that as you grow older and you start seeing yourself at those ages of people, and how health really plays into that when you start hitting these kind of milestones, or you start feeling things or seeing things or becoming high risk for different areas. I think there's just so much complexity in that too when it comes to, say, health related things as well.
And I think that, anticipatory grief absolutely being a thing, but ever since my family member died, every time my phone rings or every time I get a text, I shudder. Like, I don't want to look at my phone because it's still so new, and I just keep thinking, well, what news am I going to get today? Who's next? What's going to happen next? And that is eating me up inside just as much as the actual loss, which I think is something that we don't always talk about with grief. One type of loss can exacerbate another type of loss, or the what ifs. It's very cyclical.
So I remember when I was in junior kindergarten, my dad had gone to school to fill out all the papers, and then he came back. I was crying. I didn't want to leave him. I didn't want to go anywhere. My dad has premature hair graying. It's a trait in the family. But in my mind back then, I thought, you have gray hair means you're going to die. And for some reason, not that I knew anybody, I didn't lose anybody at that age, but I had this grief in me, the anticipatory grief that I will lose the people that I love. And I've had it all the time. Every time my dad goes out of the house, my mom goes out of the house, and now I'm on the other side of the world. So every time I receive a phone call, I'm thinking, is it going to be now? Is this going to be the message? It's so weird because I've never had that experience. I have seen other people lose people, and I guess it's been a very weird way.
How do you cope with that? I need tips.
Therapy, I guess. And it's only recently that I started talking about it because I thought it would be weird to tell someone that I'm afraid of losing my loved ones, especially when I have not experienced much around it. Like, I have lost an aunt and an uncle that I loved very much, and it really hit me very hard. I was never able to express it to anybody. I was never able to tell them how I actually felt. But it's just recently it's therapy. And I read a lot. I follow a lot of Instagram accounts. And this journal has been helping me. It's called The Sadness Book by Elias Barr. And that's really been helping me let it go.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I find that interesting too, Shruti. What I find fascinating about grief in general is it is maybe the most common trauma collectively everybody will experience likely in their life. The majority of people that live will lose somebody that they love very close to them, and they will experience what is probably one of the hardest things any human has to go through. I don't think anybody ever knows what they're going to react like or what it's going to feel like or what it's going to be like until it actually happens. And when it does happen, every time it happens, it's different. There's so much context around it. And I volunteer with a grief organization, and we talk about loss, and it sounds so cliche, but every loss is so different. And even within siblings who have lost, say, the same sibling, or they've lost the same parent, or they've both lost like a mutual friend, they have different experiences with it as well. And that's something that I've struggled with my grief. And I've lost probably too many people close to me by the age that I am right now. But my relationship with every single one of those people that I have lost is way different than people that I know, like other family members or close friends of mine. And then that also kind of, what I always think is a question, which is kind of ironic and funny for me being on the podcast today talking about grief, is who owns collective grief, right? So if I'm coming out and sharing, exactly, right? Like if you lose a parent and there's multiple children and you want to talk about it, who owns that grief to talk about it, right? When you're sharing that grief with other members of, say, your family that are also experiencing it. That's a common theme that I feel about with when I talk to a lot of folks about grief, is this confusion of how they're supposed to talk about it and who they're allowed to talk about it and what they're allowed to express because other people are feeling the same thing too. And I think that actually happens a lot with suicides, where are you allowed to say publicly or verbally how that person died? Is it your response? But if you need to, I think that's a collective thing with grief too that is very difficult to navigate and compounds a lot of problems with grief.
And I think society does a pretty bad job of telling people that there is a right way to grieve. I do think there are ways that are, maybe more unhealthy. For instance, when grief turns into self-harm of some kind, right? I actually have been thinking a lot about this in regards to my lupus diagnosis, which is people in my life, for some reason, feel like they can tell me how I should be processing it, how my grief should go, that I shouldn't be thinking about it as much. And I think we do that a lot, right? After the funeral I had a very long conversation with the family member, and she was telling me what everyone needs tomorrow is to rest. Grief takes a toll. Grief does take a toll. But I'm not sure that everyone that helps them cope. I don't know if either of you have experience with people trying to dictate grief or outline it for you in a way that was unhelpful.
Yeah, definitely. Or I bet you both have specific phrases around grief that you just grinds your gears when somebody says it to you.
Please don't tell me they're in a better place.
Yes, I was gonna say they're in a better place, or they'd be so happy for you.
They wouldn't want you to be sad.
Right, like anything like that, where I think people are just projecting things onto you, where they might be coming from the best of intended places, but it's not helpful.
Shruti, I feel like this is a huge overlap between loss of a person versus like loss of identity, right? Like there are things that people can say to us about our health that are helpful, and then there are ones that are not so helpful in terms of our processing. And I think that loss of people is the same in the sense that a lot of times we just want validation. We sometimes don't even want people to say anything. We just want people to sit with us. I think discomfort is probably one of the hardest parts about grief, right? Because it's asking someone else to take on very hard emotions. And I think that that can be really difficult, right? Weighing someone's reaction to your expression of grief, which is why therapy is a very healthy way to do it, right? You're expressing grief to someone who is not going to pass judgment on you, who's just going to allow you to sit and verbalize how you're doing.
When it comes to people telling you how to grieve, it's also about what to grieve about and what not to. So in my case, it's not like you lost someone. It's not like you lost a limb. It's not like you lost something. It could have been worse. It's either that or it is grief means that you had something to love and then you lost it. So it's better to have. Even when it comes to people, right? Relationships, losing relationships, you can grieve literally anything. But people telling you what is grief worthy and what's not also kind of hits you hard. When it comes to health, it really doesn't help. I just like to sit and grieve without being told what to grieve about or how to grieve. It's sometimes we just don't want others to know because we don't want to hear what they have to say. Most of the time, I've just kept it in, but bottling it up only made it worse for me.
And I think, Shruti, what's interesting from where you mentioned that you haven't actually, say you haven't had that experience of the loss of a person yet. What is so different that is misunderstood from the perspective of losing the sort of grieving your health is that at least with the death of a person, there's some sort of finality to it. It's this person has gone versus the grief you experience and are talking about. It's ongoing in the sense of your health and the way in your relationship with phone calls, right? And things that might trigger some of those feelings of grief is that there isn't a finality to it that death has. There's an ongoing living with that is so much different. I think it's same thing with, I always say to grieving a terminal illness, I think might be fascinatingly less complex than grieving an ongoing longer illness, because with a terminal illness, there's this idea that death is coming and there is this end, versus a long-term illness where there's so much more support needed and you don't know how long it's going to be needed. You don't know if is there still hope that things can get better. It's so much more different than grieving a death that has finality to it in a way.
I've never thought about the finality, but I think that probably, for me at least, is what makes health grief so much more complicated to other people. Because grieving your health is not something that everyone will do. We talk about this a lot, is that yes, the statistical likelihood that you experience an acute illness, very, very high. The statistical likelihood that you experience a chronic condition, not as high. And I think it is really difficult to wrap your head around the fact that grief can be lifelong. I could go an entire year and feel really accepting of my health circumstances. And then I had emergency surgery in December, and now I feel like I'm starting right back over. But that's hard for people to get, right? If you've never gone through it, like you don't understand what that constant ongoing process and dialogue with yourself is like. Would love to talk about tips or resources or anything that you have found helpful, whether it's something that you did, a place that you went, or someone said to you. I would love to know them.
My one piece of advice, which is ironic that I'm going to say this, is don't give advice. If somebody that you know or love is experiencing a loss or is grieving, just listen to them. Don't give advice unless they ask for advice. The best thing I remember somebody said to me once was, "This sucks," which just made me feel so validated. A great resource is the Dougie Center is actually the National Center for Grieving Children, but they actually have wonderful resources, I think, for anybody at any age that is going through a loss, especially your first loss. Dougie.org, they have a huge database of resources for almost most ages, and especially if you are even a person that is a caregiver of a child that's experiencing loss too, or grieving is great resources as far as grief from a death.
Good one. What about you, Shruti?
My advice would be to the people who are grieving. I recently heard Rhonda Byrne say on Jay Shetty's podcast that whatever we resist persists. And she said that feelings are there for a reason and they're actually telling you something. And yeah, grief is probably the worst feeling that you can ever have, and it's overwhelming. So she suggested something. So now whenever I feel that wave hit, I don't resist it. I don't distract myself. I just feel it. I let it wash over me, let it flow, let it overwhelm me. Cry it out for as long as it takes. And I do this every time it happens. And over time, it hasn't gotten less intense, but it doesn't last as long. So that's just been helping me. And it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to write about it. It's okay to think about it instead of, saying, hey, this happened such a long time ago. Or, hey, this doesn't really make sense, so let me not grieve. You should grieve. And the more you do that, the more you validate yourself. And that's where it starts. A lot of people can validate you, but nothing feels as good as you validating yourself.
One thing that I have found helpful, we talk a lot about like curating your social media feeds, right? And sometimes you want to avoid content and other times you want to embrace it. And so over the past month or so, I've started following a lot more grief accounts. And for me, that has been so wildly comforting, right? Because if I'm scrolling through Instagram and I see someone's vacation photos, my automatic reaction if I'm grieving is like, why do they get to do that? And then I'm met with another like reel of someone talking about the worst loss of their life, and it kind of balances it out. For some people that might be inherently triggering. For me, it's been really comfortable and comforting. Another resource, a friend had told me about something called the dinner party, and I've heard good things. Apparently they're for 21 to 45-year-olds, for people who have experienced loss, creating community around it. So worth checking out. And to anyone out there in our mighty community who is grieving, we're sitting with you. We're not going to tell you how to process it, but it's very real. It doesn't have a timeline. And thank you both to my special guest for talking about a topic that is inherently tough. But we did it. If you want more conversations like this, subscribe to Mental Health Matters by going to bit.ly/mhinbox. That's bit.ly/mhinbox. We'll see you in your inbox. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Auf Wiedersehen.